All right, and now we have the pleasure of hearing from Ali Yawar from Yale.
Hi everyone, I'm Ali. I'm going to talk to you about the foot stiffness of human feet and especially how the transverse arch of the foot influences its stiffness. Okay. So healthy arched human feet are stiff, and this foot stiffness is important from an energetics point of view. A stiff foot allows impulsive push-off on the ground, as well as allows series soft elastic elements to store energy, which can later be recovered to improve metabolic economy. However, not all feet in nature are arched. Conditions such as the flat foot in humans leads to a loss of the arches and an associated increase in flexibility, quite similar to the flat, flexible feet of primates such as this bonobo. The dependence of foot stiffness on structure has been thoroughly studied, and our current understanding mostly relies on the sagittal plane mechanics of the foot, where you see the skeletal medial longitudinal arch, which is spanned by soft tissues like the plantar fascia, forming sort of a bowstring arrangement, which resists flattening and hence imparts stiffness to the foot. However, not a lot of attention has been paid to the other arch, the transverse arch of the foot, which forms the basis of my talk, and I'm going to talk about what motivates studying the transverse arch. So this is an everyday observation. So a thin sheet like a dollar bill or a pizza slice that's floppy to begin with substantially stiffens upon curling in the transverse direction. This happens because the transverse curvature couples out of plane bending to in plane stretching. And we hypothesize that a similar mechanism makes the transverse arch contribute to foot stiffness. So we model the transverse arch to try and extract the stiffness dependence on curvature. My simple model consists of 3 rigid metatarsals, which are these long finger-like bones in the middle of the foot. These metatarsals are attached to the base via springs of torsional springs of stiffness kappa 0. And these springs model the contributions of the longitudinal arch, the bowstring contribution that I mentioned. On the distal end, we have springs of stiffness Ks that model the transverse ligaments, which are it's a band of tissues in the forefoot. Notice that these metatarsals have misaligned directions of bending. So they're hinged here, but they have misaligned bending directions. The misalignment models the curvature of the transverse arch with a radius of curvature RT. So in response to a distal vertical displacement at the foot, this is what the stiffness of the structure turns out to be. It's 2 additive terms. This is merely the contribution of the torsional springs scaled appropriately. This is the contribution of the transverse ligaments and appears with the transverse radius of curvature. Essentially, these 2 springs are in parallel in the foot. This model gives us a method to actually test experimentally this model. What we could do is, if we can increase Ks in the foot and leave everything else untouched, and measure a corresponding increase in the overall foot stiffness, we can hold the hypothesis to be good. And one way to increase Ks is to add a spring in parallel to it, which we can do experimentally by simply adding elastic sports tape to the forefoot. So I will simply do an experiment where I tie elastic sports tape to the forefoot of a subject. That's the recipe for my experiment. So I measure foot stiffness under 3 conditions of the foot: one where I don't apply a tape, one where I add a tape and expect Ks to increase, and one where I apply a tape but it has no tension to act as a control. And these subjects are healthy footed subjects that stand on a forced platform and have live feedback of the load under their foot to keep the load consistent across trials. Okay, so now I have to measure foot stiffness, and I do that in 2 ways. The first way simply looks at the height of the midfoot under half body weight load. So this height is proportional to how stiff the foot is. And we see that relative to control, the taped foot has a higher arch height at 50% body weight as compared to the no tape load, indicating that the taped foot is indeed stiffer. And so by adding this transverse stiffness, I increase the overall stiffness of the foot. This method suffers from one confound though, in that by taping the foot, I have modified the structure of the foot, and this height rise could merely be an artifact of that change in structure. And so I measure stiffness using a more perturbative method that relies on the so-called windlass mechanism of the foot. So every time you dorsiflex your toe, you pull on this tissue called the plantar fascia, compress the longitudinal arch and cause the midfoot to rise. Now for a given amount of toe dorsiflexion, this rise is inversely proportional to how stiff your foot is. And so in my subjects, I also additionally measure, I externally dorsiflex their toes and measure the amount of height rise in their arch. and find that for a representative subject, the taped foot rises much lesser for the same amount of toe dorsiflexion than the no tape and control, indicating that the taped foot is yet again stiffer. And for all of our subjects, I find that on average, the taped foot is about 50% stiffer compared to the untaped foot, which leads me to the following two conclusions. Okay. Yeah. So the transverse ligaments contribute to the sagittal plane foot stiffness because of the transverse arch, and the relative contribution of the transverse arch is more than that which can be attributed to the bowstring elements based on their contributions in reported literature. And with this, I'd like to thank people who have helped me with this project, and happy to take any questions.
Great. Go ahead and get started. Great. So while Aaron's getting set up, do we have any questions? Would you go ahead and fold down?
Okay.
Yeah, please, Art.
I might have misunderstood. So your measure of the stiffness was using Windlass, and it's really you're measuring the kinematic relationship?
Yes. So I compared a taped foot to an untaped foot. I flexed the toe by the same amount in both cases, and I noticed that the taped foot rises lesser.
Okay. Do you have any measures where you applied a force and measured the displacement?
So the first measure of the arch height itself is essentially that, because they all had constant half body weight load on their foot, and I measured a higher arch height in the case of the untaped foot, indicating that that foot is stiffer.
Okay, great. I think that's all the time we have for this session. Thanks very much, Ali.
Thank you.
Now,